Okay, welcome everyone to our Parsha Insights class. We are ready to launch talking about the Meraglim, talking about the spies today, and in particular, we're going to focus on the Chassam Sofer's understanding of Joshua's name, as well as Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch addressing the concept of the punishment of the spies. The punishment, of course, will just not to ruin the ending for you, but the punishment is that they have to wander for 40 years. And the question of why that is a valid punishment or a suitable punishment. So let's jump right in. Okay. Here we go. All right. Here we go. Vayedaber. This is the beginning of the Parasha. Vayedaber Adonai Moshe lemor. God spoke to Moses saying, Shelach lecha anashim vayaturu et eretz Canaan. Send the men who will scout the land of Canaan. Asher ani noten livnei Yisrael, which I give to the children of Israel. Ish echad lamatei avatav. One person from each tribe is going to go. Tishlachu kol nasi bahem. It's going to be a chieftain. It's going to be somebody in a position of authority from each tribe. Vayishlach otam Moshe mimidbar Paran. So Moses sent. They're going to be now. We know how the story ends. That they're going to be 12 spies from each tribe, and Moses sends them al pi Hashem, as God commanded. Kulam anashim rashay v'nei Yisrael hema. These were all leaders of Israel. Ve'ele shmotam. And then we're going to go through the list of names, and the names are very instructive as well, maybe for another time looking at each name individually, but there is a lot of holiness in these names as well. So here's the first one. So Lamate Ruvain, Ve'elish Botan Lamate Ruvain, for the tribe of Reuben, the guy's name was Shamua ben Zakur. Lamate Shimon, for the tribe of Simon, Shaphat ben Chori. Lamate Yehuda, Kalev ben Yefuneh. So now it's starting to get a little bit familiar. Kalev is going to be one of the shining examples of integrity. He'll be one of the two who comes back with a positive report. Lamate Yisachar, Yigal ben Yosef. So by the way, just looking at these names for a second, Shamua, what do you see in there? Shamua. It means, from the Hebrew word, lishmoa, to hear.
Yeah.
His father's name was Zakur. What do you hear? Remember. Okay, so the first guy's name is Hearing the Son of Remembering. And that's a pretty good name. And the connotations of those attributes are fairly positive in Judaism. That's a pretty holy name. The next guy, Shafat, from the Hebrew word Shofet, which is a judge. Ben Chori, by the way, you heard Ben Chorin, remember from Halach Ma'anya, that last year we were slaves, and now we are Ben Chorin. It's a free person. So judge, the son of freedom. That's a pretty holy name. And now Kalev. What's in that name?
Well, Kalev is a dog, so I don't know.
I think you hit the nail on the head, Steve. You know, the guy who is holy, the son of remembering, he sins. The judge, the son of freedom, he sins. The dog, he's holy. Because, and one of the ways of interpreting this is, don't judge a book by its cover. That there's something to be said about overcoming one's circumstances in life. And if you would have guessed of which of these people was going to be the holy one, Kalev would not have been it. But guess what? It's Kalev. For the tribe of Yisachar, Yigal ben Yosef. Yigal, from the word goel, to redeem. Lamate Ephraim, from the tribe of Ephraim, Hoshea bin Nun. Hoshea comes from the Hebrew word salvation.
Oh, save, yeah.
To save. Hoshana, Hosanna, as we translate. Hoshana comes from the same word. Hoshea bin Nun. Lamate Binyamin, Palti ben Rafu. Rafu, from the Hebrew word to heal. Lamate Zevulun, Gadiel ben Sodi. Okay. Lamate Yosef, Lamate Menashe. So there are going to be two. With, Yosef has Ephraim and Menashe. So Mate Menashe, Gadi ben Susi. It's similar to Gadiel ben Sodi. Lamate Dan, for the tribe of Amiel ben Gemali, my nation of God. Lamate Asher, Stur ben Michael. Naphtali, Nachbi ben Vafsi. Okay, we're getting to the end. Lamate Gad, Geuel ben Mach. Okay, so those are the names. And by the way, you're going to notice there's one name that we know better than anyone. The most famous here is going to be Hoshea bin Nun, because he is the one who takes the children of Israel into the promised land. He is the leader after Moses. Eile Shmot Anashim, these are the names of the people, Asher Shalach Moshe Latura Ta'aretz, that Moses sent to go wander the land. And this is the phrase we're going to look at. Vayikra Moshe LaHoshea bin Nun Yehoshua. Moses changed Hoshea's name, turned him from Hoshea into Yehoshua. And the Torah doesn't explain why. The Torah doesn't say that. I was thinking, who was it? It was President George W. Bush, who was known for giving everybody a nickname. Everyone around him had a nickname, whatever it was. If he called you by that, and sometimes the leader has the capacity to do that, to define the identity. So Moshe, is he giving Yehoshua a nickname? Is he changing his name? Until now, God's been the one to change names. Avram became Avraham. Sarai became Sarah. So what is the name change? It goes from 4 letters to 5 letters. All Moshe does is add the letter Yud. That's all Moshe does, is takes a Yud and puts it at the beginning of the name. And Moshe turns Hoshea to Yehoshua. So, but what did he do? Like, what is that change? Any ideas? Turns Hoshea, by the way, a holy name, means to save, salvation, turns it into Yehoshua.
Would the Yeh come from the Israelites?
The Yud, okay, so there's one assumption which the sages share, which is that the Yud has to come from somewhere. We can't just create a Yud. And the question we're going to ask is, where did it fall from? This Yud that he appended to Yoshua's name, where did it come from? So it could be Yisrael. That's a good suggestion. Anything else?
Hashem.
Good. Hashem. Yeah. Right? That's what we use that. So suddenly he has God's name as part of his name. And by the way, the 4-letter name of God, Yud, Hey, and
Vav.
And then Vav, and then Hey. So suddenly, at least using 3 letters, but one repeated, you can spell God's name within Yehoshua's name. So what Moshe did was turn Hoshea's name from a really great name into a beyond great name, into a name with God's name embedded in it. There's a midrash, the midrash Lekach Tov, and it's attributed to Reb Tuvia ben Asher, who's 11th century in Mainz, who they say was a teacher, or presumably was a teacher of Rashi, who collected these midrashim, and the midrash Lekach Tov says the following. He says, what happened? Vayomer Elohim el Avraham. So God said to Abraham, Sarai Ishtecha. Here's another name change. Sarai Ishtecha, your wife Sarai, Lo Tikrat Shma Sarai, Ki Sarah Shma. Her name is Sarah. So Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha, one of the sages, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha, said, so you see what happened? He took a Yud and turned it into a Hey. So what did God really do? What's the numerical value of the letter Yud?
Yeah, 10.
10. And the
10?
numerical value of the letter Hey
No.
is 5.
5.
So God took the 10 and turned it into 5. Now that's quite a trick to make change. But what happened to the other 5? What happened to the other hay? Avraham. Avram got an extra hay. So if you actually count the numerical value of Avram and Sarai, their previous names, is exactly the same as the numerical value of Avraham and Sarah, of their new names. Because all God did was take the Yud from Sarai, divide it in half into 2 hays, give 1 hay to Sarah and 1 hay to Avraham. So Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, he said, Yud shenatal HaKadosh Baruch Hu Sarai, the Yud that God took from Sarai, nechlak chetzio leSarah v'chetzio leAvraham. It was divided. Half was given to Sarah, half was given to Avraham. Okay. And Rav Mana, so another sage, says l'shavar hayta Sarah la'ama. Sarah used to be just for her nation, just for her people. Achshav l'chol ba'ei olam. Now she's belongs to everyone. V'yud shenatal mi Sarai. What happened with here's another interpretation. What happened with the Yud that was taken from Sarai? Zacha liot berosh Shem Yehoshua. It then was brought to the beginning of the name Yehoshua. So according to this midrash, when Moshe turns Hosea into Yehoshua, where did he get the Yud? He borrowed it from Sarai, from our matriarch, from her previous name. Because you can't just lose a letter. It has to go somewhere. It fell all the way down to Yehoshua. He received Sarah's name. There's a very, I would say, challenging midrash in the Torah Tamima that's quoted. It's a Talmud Yerushalmi is quoted in the Torah Tamima, which is a collection of midrashim and Talmudic texts on the verses. And it says a little bit further. It says, according to Rabbi Hoshaya, Yud shenatal me'imenu Sarah, the Yud that was taken from Sarah, from Sarai. It actually, these letters have feelings. Allah v'nishtateach lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this letter Yud came to God and prostrated itself and begged before God. This letter, which now had no home, it was kicked out. Sarah now has a hay at the end of her name. And what happened to this Yud, this poor Nebuch little Yud? What's going to happen to it? And said, Ribon ha'olamim, God, akartani min hatzadeket hazot, you have uprooted me from this righteous woman. God, what have you done to me, says the Yud. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So God said to the letter, Selacha, go out, you'll be okay. L'she'avar, in the past, hayita natun b'shem nekeva, you were in a woman's name, uvesof teva, and at the end of the word, chayecha, by your life, look at what I've done for you now. Ani notencha b'shem zachar, I've placed you in a man's name, uvarosha teva, and at the beginning of the name. And that's when Moshe turns Hosea into Yehoshua. So it's a very challenging midrash because the presumption is that for a letter, it's a greater honor to be in a man's name than it is to be in a woman's name. I imagine there might be some disagreement on this call with that assumption. But the second half of the assumption is, I think, equally interesting, which is that to be at the beginning of the name is a greater honor to be than at the end of the name. So the Yud that was at the end of Sarai's name and was dropped when she became Sarah, now gets put in a place of prominence as Hosea becomes Yehoshua. That's where the Yud from Sarai wandered. Okay, then we're going to get into now just motivation.
Wait.
Please.
Doesn't that mean then that the last letter of her name was so important and so amazing that in fact,
very
there's a nice apologetic way to get away with that.
Wow,
statement.
that's a very holy assumption by Rabbi Abi that the last letter of this holy woman's name was so important. Imagine how important the first letters of her name must be if the last letter was worthy of being put in the front of Yehoshua's name. Okay, I like that. That turned the entire thing around on its head and completely apologized for that midrash. So thank you. That was great. Okay, the Targum Yonatan, which is an Aramaic translation of the Talmud, it is attributed to Yonatan ben Uziel, who was a student of Hillel the elder. There were a number of Hillels, but Hillel Hazaken, who was the Hillel that we know from Pirkei Avot, from the Ethics of Our Fathers, who says, Im eina nili mili, if I'm not for myself, then who, and so on. Im lo achshav matai, and if not now, when? And he says, Al da'atif datfuch v'sof metafai chitufun, because you caused others to drown, so you are being drowned, he said to a skull that was floating on the river. He is Hillel Hazaken. So his student, Yonatan ben Uziel, is the one who this translation of the Torah is attributed to. And it's a translation to Aramaic because there's a unique concept that we are to read the Torah in translation in addition to the original text. There's a concept called Shnaim Mikra ve'echad Targum, which means reading the Parsha twice in the original and once in translation every week. And actually the acronym for that is the word Shmot, or the book of Exodus, but Shmot stands for Shnaim Mikra ve'echad Targum, twice reading the original, once reading in translation. And this was the translation, amongst others, that they were referring to when they talk about an Aramaic translation. And the translation is never just a translation. And we've learned that a number of times. We've seen that constantly, and we'll see it again today in a little bit. But a translation is never just a translation because there's always some type of commentary that's fit into a translation. And we'll take a better look at that in just a few moments. But for now, the Aramaic translation, it offers an insight into why this name change is taking place. These are the names of the men who Moshe sent to explore the land. They translate the verse, right? This is verse 16. So we're just going back to the original verse for a second. Verse 16, Eile Shmot, these are the names of the men, Asher Shelach Moshe Latur Ta'ar, that Moses sent to spy the land. And Moses called Hoshea bin Nun Yehoshua. So the translation says, and when Moses saw his humility, he called Hoshea bar Nun Yehoshua. He adds something. He says it's not just that Moshe said, okay, your name is now, your name was this yesterday and today it's going to be something different. No, that's not what it is. Is that he saw something special in him. He saw his humility and therefore he changed his name. And now is our turn to ask these questions. Why does humility warrant a name change? Why suddenly does Moses, inspired by Joshua's humility, he is about to send him to the land, about to send him off on his mission to be a spy, and says, Joshua, or Hoshua, his name was back then, before Hosea, he said, Hosea, you are exceedingly humble, and therefore you need a new name. And that name, as we said before, is going to have the name of God in it. So why does Joshua need this new name? Why does one's humility necessitate a new identity? What's happening? And that's where the Chatam Sofer comes in. And the Chatam Sofer says, he quotes the Targum Yonatan, and he says, V'yesh lefaresh. You could explain it like this. Kol adam tzarich siyata dishmaya. Every person needs divine help. We need God's help. Lilchom neged hayetzer hara, to fight against the evil inclination. Right? Everyone needs help. Kamosha Amru Chazal, the sages said that if God weren't there to help a person could not survive the battle against the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. V'im, he continues, the Chassam Sofer continues, V'im hu bein anashim risha'im. If you find yourself amongst bad people, hamifatim, and who are trying to seduce a person, to do something bad, to draw them into bad behavior, V'yesh lo Yetzer Hara mibayit u'michutz, and the person is surrounded by the evil inclination. Imagine that. A person is so tempted, they're surrounded by all this. Sarich lazer kaful or laser kaful. A person needs double the help. Okay, so the point number one is that we all need help in our battle against the Yetzer Hara, in our battle against the evil inclination. V'im ha'adam hahu, and if the person we're talking about, hu anav, if he's humble, ve'eno medaber bifnei misha gadol mimenu, and the person is always respectful to greater people. They're always putting themselves in a position of inferiority. They're always being respectful of others, and doesn't speak before and being deferential. And if the person who's greater than them is misleading them, a person needs even more help. So here's what we're saying. Here's what Chasam Sofer is saying. Joshua is going, he's one of 12 great leaders. These are all very strong personalities, strong people. These are all very influential people. Joshua, like Moses, is very, very humble. Where does Joshua fit in the group dynamic? Where is he amongst this group? If he is so humble and they're not righteous and there's wickedness amongst them and they're going to come back with a negative report, a humble person needs help, needs strength, needs koyach. And that, the Chasam Sofer says, that's what Moshe gave to Yehoshua when he changed his name. He said, Yehoshua, you're humble. And being humble is a really good thing, unless you need to speak truth to power. In which case, you need to summon the courage. I remember, thinking of this midrash. My teacher, Rabbi Avi Weiss, who many of you have come to know through his visits to Shara Shamayim or through many, many, many years. And I met him as his student, going to his rabbinical school. And he is one of the most soft-spoken, gentle, compassionate people that one would ever meet in life. He is a deeply sensitive human being who when we go out to dinner at a restaurant with him, before you know it, I've been to that restaurant 20 times. I've been served by that waiter 20. I don't know the waiter's name. Before you know it, Rabbi Weiss is hugging the waiter and learning their entire life story and understanding who that person. He's just an extraordinarily compassionate, connecting, soft-spoken individual. And then one evening, there was a tribute dinner to Rabbi Weiss. I don't recall exactly the cause or exactly the organization was Amcha. I think it was their annual dinner. And they did a video of tribute to Rabbi Weiss. And it was his activist side. And suddenly my soft-spoken teacher was there on the screen, climbing fences at Auschwitz, protesting the building of the church, of the nunnery, of the monastery at Auschwitz. Suddenly he was fighting for Soviet Jewry and yelling at the top of his lungs on the street of New York. Suddenly he was being arrested for civil disobedience, speaking truth to power. And this was my soft-spoken teacher. And I realized, yes, it is. That this is the legacy of Yehoshua, of being humble, of being soft-spoken, of being deferential, of being compassionate, of being soft. But at the same time, when you have to speak truth, when you have to speak up, at that same time, being someone who doesn't hesitate to have courage and to speak loudly and to make an impact. And that was Moshe's gift to Yehoshua, was by putting the name of God in his name, giving him the koyach, giving him the inspiration to speak up, to be heard. Humility is good sometimes, but when it comes to saying the truth, when it comes to coming back and giving a report of the land of Israel to the people, to establishing, you, Yehoshua, are going to have strength that's going to belie your humble nature. That was the Chasam Sofer on Yehoshua's name change. Any questions before we move on to part 2? Okay, great. So now the sin happens. We're skipping ahead a chapter. The sin has happened. God's not happy. God said, Ad matai la'edah hara'a hazot. Interestingly enough, God said, how long will this wicked edah, this wicked community? And there's a law, a halacha, that's derived from this word, from the word edah. Who is this community referring to? The evil, the wicked community. Who is it referring to specifically? It's referring to a group of people. Who? It's referring to the 10 spies, right? The 10 spies who came back with a negative report. That's the community. And the number 10 is a magical number because our sages learned from this word the concept of a minyan, that a community is called 10 people because the verse says this wicked community. It's a fascinating way of learning a source for what's required for a minyan, right? They are complaining, they are muttering against me, and so on and so forth. And let's go down to the actual punishment for a moment. And the punishment is, you can read the rest on your own time. Therefore, you shall bear your punishment for 40 years, corresponding for the number of days, 40 days that you scouted the land, a year for each day. A year for each day. Thus you shall know what it means to thwart me. Okay? You're going to bear your punishment for 40. So you get the logic? Why did the children of Israel have to wander in the desert for 40 years? Because the spies went into the land for 40 days. Wait, does that make sense? They went in for 40 days and therefore they're punished for 40 years? And by the way, just one way in which translations often will make will be a comment. In the Hebrew, it says Yom Lashana, a day for every year. It's the opposite. A day, Yom Lashana, for every year. The translation, a year for every day. The translation switches it around. And maybe we'll see why in a moment. So the punishment, they went in for 40 days and they were punished to wander for 40 years. Rabbeinu Bachya from 13th, 14th century Spain says a day for every year. We would have expected the Torah to write it the opposite, a year for a day, which is what the translation says. That the punishment for each day the spies have spent traveling the land and planning to slander it would be that the people would have to spend an additional year in the desert. Theirs would be nomads' tents, which flutter in the wind in existence daily, reminding them of the insecurity on earth. Not only that, but according to the context of the story, mention the punishment should have preceded mention of the sin. Okay, a separate point. But when the Torah chose the wording a day for a year, we must consider the fact that seeing the land of Israel has been described as an area by 400 miles by 400 miles. This is an area in which they could not have covered by 40 days. However, seeing God had known in advance that the punishment would be like this, he telescoped the distance under their feet so they could cover it in such a short period of time. That's what it means, a day for every year. Just like a father who is forced to inflict a blow on the child, he doesn't inflict a cruel blow, but is considered as possible. Meaning, normally, if we're going to take this punishment, which is a year for every day that they wandered the land, if they're going to wander the land, it's going to take them. How long would it take any of us to walk through Israel? Every inch of the land. It would take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of days, or every mile of land, not even every inch, hundreds and hundreds, thousands of days. And therefore, the children of Israel will be walking for thousands of years. This was compassionate that God allowed them to go in only for 40 days. And therefore, the punishment was only for 40 years. And the punishment is fitting that they didn't want did not want to go into the land and to settle in the land, and therefore they were not allowed to be settled, and therefore they had to wander around because they weren't prepared. They weren't prepared to settle. Okay, and the Talmud says something else. It says all the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept that night. Rabbah said that Rabbi Yochanan taught that night was Tisha B'Av. That an additional fact is that the sin of the spies took place on Tisha B'Av, on the saddest day of the Hebrew calendar. And God said to them, you cried for nothing on that day, B'chiyah shel chinam, literally a free crying, crying for no reason. You cried because there was a false report about fake news about Israel and about what was waiting for you, and that you couldn't go in, said the spies. And the people said, oy vey, we can't go in because the spies say we can't go in. That's a meaningless cry. I'm going to ani kovea lachem, that day will be for you, b'chiyah ledorot, weeping for all generations. Tisha B'Av, that happened on Tisha B'Av, the sin of the spies. And two more comments, the Kli Yakar, who was Rav Shlomo Ephraim Lunshitz from 16th century, he was the Rav of Prague. And he said, Shana liyom, a year for every day, a year for every day. Yom l'shana, he turns it around. Yom l'shana, he says, no, not a day for a year, but a year for a day, mevayale. It should have been 1 year for every day. 40 years corresponding to 40 days. Why does it say 1 day? A day for the year, a day for the year. So what does he say? He says, we'll skip ahead for a moment, Amru ki biyom zeh hainu, that was Tisha B'Av, ki bo bachu b'chiyah lechinam, is referring specifically to Tisha B'Av. All came b'chol yom Tisha B'Av, every Tisha B'Av. Hayu kovrim matehem, that was also part of the custom, is that they would bury their dead on Tisha B'Av itself in the wilderness. Lekach ne'amar yom l'shana shebachol shana, every year. Tisu avanotechem yom echad, they have to relive the sin every day. They have to relive the sin, 1 day a year, they have to relive the sin. So it's very different than having to carry the sin. The punishment, yes, it's the wandering for 40 years, corresponding to the 40 days that the spies were in the land, but the punishment is even more. The punishment is that there's going to be 1 day every year in which you're brought back to the sin, as opposed to a normal punishment, which becomes bearable over time, right? A normal punishment, if we, for example, if we were to punish a child, let's say theoretically, a child would misbehave. And theoretically, we would say, okay, no television for you for a week, let's say. That's a fairly lenient punishment, but let's say the crime wasn't so dramatic. No television for 1 week. So you know what happens to the kid? In the first moments of being punished, it's devastating. I want to watch TV. Maybe there are tears. Maybe the intensity of the punishment really touches them deeply, and they're disturbed by it, and it's distressing, maybe. But what happens in day 6? It's a little bit better. This isn't so bad. We get used to our realities. The Kli Yakar said, this is the different kind of punishment. They sinned 40 days. And they were punished for 40 years, but you get used to everything. So a punishment by year 32, that punishment must have been just fine. We get used to it, like anything else in life. No, 1 day a year, you have to relive the intensity of what you did. 1 day, Tisha B'Av, every year. That's what it means. Yom l'shana, 1 day a year, 1 day a year. Not 40 years punishment, but Tisha B'Av is going to be your punishment. A sad day every year, remembering why it is that you're here wandering in the wilderness and not over there settled in the land of Israel. It's a very powerful way of being punished. And I wonder if in punishing our children, we should we should entertain this. Instead of no television for the next week, no television on Tuesdays for the next 7 weeks. Every 1 day a week, you'll have to relive this moment of sin. Maybe there are different ways of meting out punishment or corrective measures to make people understand what they did wrong and help them become better people. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hersham will close with this. He says, by fitting this time of duration of the punishment, 40 years, in proportion to the sin, 40 days, the sin is kept in the minds of penitents during the whole course of the duration of the punishment. This method by which, simply by using some external similarity of numbers, 40 and 40, right? 40 days is not the same thing as 40 years, he says, but there is an external similarity. Something is brought to and kept in the mind is frequently used by our sages in their institutions. And I want to apply what he's saying to kind of a parenting concept, or a concept of setting rules and punishments, which is that, as far as I understand, and invite anyone to chime in who knows better than I in this, but our understanding is that in order for a punishment to be effective, it has to fit the crime. That when it comes to, for example, let's go back to disciplining a child, that if the punishment is random, if one just punishes a child with things that they like, you can't have, because you pulled your sister's hair, you can't have candy. Well, what does candy have to do with pulling hair? What's the connection? And how will simply enforcing corrective measures to withhold pleasure, how will that correct the behavior that led to the hair pulling? For example, I'm sorry if all of my parenting examples have to do with long hair and sisters and all of that. That's just the reality that we know. But that's the question. So Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch says, the punishment was that they wander, and there is a connection, not going into land, therefore you have to wander. But the punishment, the length of the punishment was 40. And not that, the 40 days the spies were in is not the same thing as 40 years. You can't compare 2 units of time, but Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch says by simply using the same measurement of the number 40, yeah, it's not the same thing. It's not even similar. It's just a number that's the same. But even by making those connections, you're staying connected to the sin, to the crime. And the punishment, therefore, is reminding them of the crime. And therefore, that makes the punishment much more effective. It's a challenge in parenting. It's a challenge in laws in general. It's a challenge in government's punitive measures as means of deterrence and as means of corrective behavior. This is a challenge to the entire system of incarceration, or the way that society punishes people for doing wrong things. It's one thing to punish in measure. If a person, God forbid, cheats on their taxes, they have to pay a penalty. And that makes sense because you took money, so you give money, and that's the way punishments work. But how about, incarceration for a crime? How is that, how does that work? So incarceration works for somebody who kidnapped someone else. So that works. That's a direct corrective measure that's connected directly to the crime. But how does it work for someone who, how is incarceration an option for, I'm trying to think of a rad, but let's talk about, drug-related crimes. We could talk about nonviolent crimes. We could talk about victimless crime, whatever it is. One could imagine better ways in which society could affect punitive measures in ways that match and that fit the crime. And Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, says this is the idea of the 40 and the 40. It's not the same thing, but at least it triggers an awareness of what went wrong and why there's a punishment in the first place. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. We looked at 2 different concepts, one of Hosea turning into Yehoshua, and the idea that Yud came from somewhere. Maybe it came from Sarai. And the idea that, and the Chasam Sofer's very, very compelling idea that name was meant to give Joshua, the humble one, courage and strength and confidence in confronting those who he might have seen as his superior. And then Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch and others, amongst others, Rabbeinu Bachya and the Kli Yakar and the Midrashim, trying to explain why a 40-year punishment of wandering was an appropriate punishment for 40 days of the spies' fake news and fake reports about the land of Israel. Any comments or questions?
Did the punishment work?
That's an excellent question, Terry. And I think, part of the punishment was that no one gets in. Part of the punishment was that none of you are going into the land of Israel. That whole first generation died in in the wilderness. Although none who left Egypt were able to go into the land, with the exception of Joshua, I believe, and Caleb. But everyone else had to. So the punishment was really partly that they would live out their lives. They wouldn't die now, which is not a punishment. That's a little bit of a blessing. None of you are going to get into the land. So you have a choice. You could go into the land now, but none of you are coming. You'll all die today. Or you could wander around for 40 years, build yourself a society, build yourself a civilization, become a cohesive unit, both militarily and socially, and then go into the land in 40 years once the next generation comes in. So there is a little bit of a blessing in that punishment. Maimonides says in the laws of repentance that the only way one knows if repentance has worked is if one's in the same situation and doesn't make the same mistakes with the exact same conditions, the exact same pressures, and doesn't make the same mistakes. So we'll never know if it really worked to change them, but none of them were able to go into the land. It's a good question. Susan.
Okay.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Sorry, Rabbi, where did they all live, those others that never went there?
They all died in the wilderness. They were all buried in the wilderness.
Really?
The entire generation. And part of the tradition, what we alluded to, is that on Tisha B'Av, it was the day in which they buried their dead. That was the annual day of death. And people would die on Tisha B'Av. And the way one of the traditions is that actually Tu B'Av, the 15th of Av, 6 days later, is a day of celebration. Why? Because in the last year before going into the land, all of the people who thought they weren't going to make it, they all lied down in their graves and prepared to die. And yet they woke up the next morning and they said, oh, we must have miscalculated the day. Today's the day. Next morning, still there. And so on and so until almost a week passed, and they realized on Tu B'Av, with the full moon on the 15th of Av, they realized, wait a second, this year, what's been happening for the last 39 years is not going to happen. We're going to live to see the land of Israel. Let's go. That the death is stopping. So yeah, there was a tradition that they all died and were buried in the wilderness.
So does that mean that only the two, after all those years, just two people, Yaakov and not Yaakov, Yeshua and Caleb, were the only two people who actually got into the land of
Yes,
Israel?
I believe that there's a tradition like that the two who gave the positive reports were the only two to enter the land. Yeah.
And does that mean then that from forever on, we're the descendants of those people?
Those two people.
No, because the descendants of the others also came into the land, just that not they themselves, right? Moses' children went into the land and grandchildren got into Israel. Just from the original generation, it was Yehoshua and Caleb.
Okay.
Caleb, who went to Hebron, and Joshua, who was the leader of the people when they went in.
And their wives and children. Because we had to come from somewhere, and if there were no women, they would have been hard.
Oh, yeah. Well, there were lots of women. There were lots of daughters. There were lots of sons. There were lots of the next generation. Were all there. Just those who had lived,
Wandering the wilderness.
those who had walked through the sea to leave Egypt did not walk across through the river to enter Israel.
Okay.
That was an entire generation gone, with the exception of two.
Okay, Rabbi, can I ask you one more question?
Please.
This is to do with, but not to do with, what's going on in Canada today is extremely disturbing. What happened to all the Indian children? It's like a Holocaust that took place.
Yes.
It's devastating. It's devastating. And I grew up in Saskatchewan, and my father was a doctor. We knew about something was wrong, but he wasn't a doctor for the Indians. They had their own doctor, but there were rumors even, and now I'm going to be 76 this week. And when I was a young child, I remember hearing about this. And this is how long Canada has ignored it.
Yes. Oh, it's an extraordinary tragedy. There
Yeah.
are, our Western countries, Europe, North America, they're all built on original sins.
Yeah.
Right. That's the, having grown up in the United States and come to learn about Canadian history, at least in the United States, there are two original sins that society is built on. One is the way that they treated the Aboriginals or treated Indigenous people. And the
Yeah.
second is the legacy of slavery. And Canada has one of those original sins. And it's a great source of shame that we'll have to understand more and more about what we did.
Yeah, and what we didn't, what
And what
never happened. The governments never dealt with it.
exactly.
The authorities knew about it.
Yeah.
I
Absolutely.
want to know what the correlation is between all the weddings on Tu B'Av.
Wait, you're
Today.
muted.
Most of the
So get to you're muted again, but I think the question is Tu B'Av is the Jewish Valentine's Day is
right.
so
Right.
what's the connection between what we just talked about on Tu B'Av about the people rising from their graves, realizing they're going to live, and the concept of love on Tu B'Av? And the answer is that many of these days have multiple reasons associated with them, and they are they're typically all of the same idea or the same emotion. So Tisha B'Av, there's a whole list of Shiva Sarba Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz. There's a whole list of things that happened, all of them bad. And Tisha B'Av, there's a list of things that happened, all of them bad, including the destructions of the temple, including the sin of the spies, and including other things. And Tu B'Av, there are a number of things, all of them good, including that was the day, as the Mishnah says, that the young maidens would go out in the fields and try to attract the attention of the eligible men, and so on and so forth. So all of that is associated with that same day of Tu B'Av, but it's just a happy good day in general. Okay, we'll close with that and wish everyone a fantastic day and wonderful to see you, and a Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.
Thank you.
And see you next
Thank
week.
you.
Shabbat Shalom.
See you
Thank
next
you. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.